What exactly happened to Dad that night? Why doesn't he want to talk about it? Hit subscribe to join us on this eerie journey. Summary. Get summary. At the start of company. During the 2 lockdown, my dad very concerned said, "Frank, please don't think that I'm crazy, but I swear that I saw 3 grey aliens walking across the street, and then they went into the woods." I asked him how tall. He said very skinny creatures, about 4 feet tall. 2 days later as well, and I'm not joking, a military person skydived into their community. I witnessed it while we were driving back into the neighborhood, and we were like, what the actual heck, white vans running in and out of the neighborhood non-stop. You would see them at least 20 to 30 times per day, which made me believe that something happened that was far beyond company. To add to all of this, about a month later my dad randomly leaves the house while I'm visiting, says that he wants to go and be with God. He's completely at peace, acting totally normal, leaves the house and walks down the street. The cops pick him up, though. The cops call me, and when I'm on the phone with the cop, he says, "Hang on real quick." Then I hear, "Oh no, then a loud gunshot." At this point obviously I'm panicking, thinking that my dad was shot. A totally different cop gets on the phone. I hadn't talked to this guy before, says sorry, that was unrelated. Your dad is fine and we'll bring him home now. In that moment I literally thought to myself, was the original cop that I talked to shot and replaced or something? Did he see one of those greys and had to shoot it? He was in complete panic with his voice, but the next cop on the phone was completely fine, as if nothing had happened anyway. That was weird, and Dad comes home with them and instead says that he wants to go and check himself into a hotel for a few days, so they offered to drive him to the hotel. Dad turns off his phone, won't let anybody come and visit him, has no communication with us during this time, says that he just wants to be alone. Eventually he comes back home after the few days like nothing happened whatsoever, and to this day says, "I don't want to talk about what happened that night," and I'm like, "Yeah. But it was weird, like, can you explain what happened and why you felt that way?" And he's just like, "No, I don't want to get into that personally. I think that he saw something or something serious happened, and he's concerned that if he says something, that he'll be labeled insane." But what do you guys think about this? I legit got scared thinking that they replace my dad or something. The grey alien thing was super weird too, and it was really weird to hear a gunshot on the phone and then suddenly I'm speaking to a different cop. I remember when the cops came by the house to drop him off as well, and their demeanor was just incredibly weird. I dare say almost like they were not human. They just didn't act right. My fiancé and I went for a 3-day trip to Gatlinburg, and we've spent our days in the mountains, hiking and spending time in and around the national park. Tonight at around midnight, trying to get all the time in the mountains that we can, we decided to take an hour drive from our hotel room up the mountain to an overview, or lookout type of spot right on top of said mountain to see if we can catch an awesome look at the stars, because there's a lot of lights in Gatlinburg at night. Driving up there, neither of us noticed literally anything off other than that the mountain in. The winds are a little spooky at night. I'm from Florida, so it's just unfamiliar, I guess, but as soon as we got to where we were going and she and I got out of the car, I'm almost overwhelmed, with just a vile, oppressive feeling outside with me, but not wanting to make the lady uncomfortable. I don't react too much just yet. The wind is absolutely roaring and unfortunately we couldn't see any stars due to cloud cover. So I tell her that I'm going to step to the side and pee and then we can get back to the hotel room. Now, as soon as I get like 10 feet away, I get a very strange feeling of extreme vulnerability and detachment from everything around me, almost as though I'm miles away from the nearest person, though obviously I'm feet away from my fiancé. I turn around to walk back to the car, and that was when I heard something off to my right, and instinctively looked over to see something roughly human size go down to coyote size, and kind of just hop over a rail from about 200 feet, maybe more feet away. I quickly get back to the car and usher my fiancé in, still not trying to scare her, or at least show her that I'm scared. But she asked if I was all right, and my reaction was a dead giveaway. But we jumped in and we sped off. Never in my life have I ever experienced anything like this, and never in my life have I ever really had a reason to be made uncomfortable of just being outside. But I truly believe that I saw something weird that night in those woods with us. One evening I was out in Lacey, WA, to pick up a handgun that I had recently purchased for protection contrary to the pickup status, both online and sent to my mail. The store didn't have it in stock yet, and told me to come back in another week. I lived about an hour from Lacey at the time, and when I had gotten there evening, rush hour was just beginning to become unbearable. I didn't want to drive all the way back home just yet, as it would add an additional hour to my already long commute anyway. Side note too is that the car that I was driving belonged to my dad, and I was borrowing it until I had enough. Mine saved up for a new car after my beloved Honda had broken down the previous year. But I killed some time bumming around the store, and I purchased my firearm from then decided to drive over to the nearest coffee shop. It was a newly built cabin-style cafe with a modern twist. The barista handed me my 16-0 dirty chai and I walked back out to my car. I then drove to a gas station around the corner, still trying to kill some time until traffic thinned out. The car didn't need any gas or anything, so I pulled into a parking spot right at the corner of the four-way street, the block that the gas station was on. I turned off the engine and stepped outside and lit up a smoke, leaning against the driver's side door so as to not stink up the interior. The weather was overcast and drizzly, but not overly cold. It was now dusk and most daylight had disappeared. The stop lights in the intersection were diffused by the late autumn mist and I watched them flicker from green to yellow to red and again, as the traffic was orchestrated accordingly, zoned out by the lights and being generally lost in thought. While enjoying my coffee and smoke, I didn't notice the man walking toward me until he was already halfway across the street. He was white, average height, strawberry blonde. Maybe in his mid-20s. He definitely hadn't changed his clothes in a good while, and carried a backpack that I assumed to be full of the few belongings that he had. He didn't smell, but he looked raggedy and unkempt for sure. My immediate thought was that drugs were likely a part of his habitual lifestyle. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, though, but I'm always cautious, having grown up in the suburbs of Seattle. The man finished crossing the street awkwardly limping toward my car, maintaining eye contact and a winced grin. I locked my car out of caution, but remained outside smoking casually. Normally I'm not a social person, but I don't go out of my way to be unpleasant either. He approached me and stood about 10 feet away, when he said hello and asked if I had a light. I complied hesitantly, but saw no harm in meeting his simple request, taking 2 steps forward. I lit his cigarette, which he was holding out toward me. While approaching, he attempted to make small talk, weaving in hints that he had just gotten off the bus, and still needed to get down the road another block somewhere in this poorly crafted story. He stopped himself mid-sentence like a bad actor, and pretended to be struck by an epiphany. "Hey, would you mind just dropping me off down the road? It's not very far." I apologized and said that I couldn't, because it was my dad's car and not my own, and I didn't feel comfortable without my father's permission. I admit it was a stupid yet plausible excuse I came up with on the spot. Mr. Unkempt did not like my answer, and his smile immediately turned tense and flat-lined. Clearly upset, he became more insistent, "But it's just down the road," he wed. "My leg is killing me, and it wouldn't even be far for you. I'll give you a cigarette." His persistence and sudden burst of hostility made my hair stand up. I firmly said no, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. It's my dad's car, and he has set the rules with 10 years of hospitality under my belt." I immediately offered him alternate logical ideas of what he could do to get where he needed to be. I even mentioned maybe someone in the gas station, that we outside of maybe they could help him out or call him a riot or something. Each word that I said made him increasingly irate, and he began curling his fingers into fists, not in a threatening way, but like a toddler about to scream blood murder for not getting their way. He seemed to pause and size me up in a fleeting moment. I'm small and I'm not at all intimidating physically, so I told him that I hope he makes it home safe. Quickly unlocked my car, jumped in and locked myself inside. When looking up from locking the car door, I saw him speed walking back across the street from the direction that he originally came from. No limp, no awkward walk whatsoever, no distress or pain showing even slightly, just a normal speed walk of a physically well person, a rageful person. I knew then that I dodged a bullet, and I felt pretty dumb for hanging around the city after dark alone like that. At that point I didn't care about traffic anymore, so I turned over my engine and hightailed it home in what ended up being an hour and 45-minute drive. But this time the traffic was 100 worth the inconvenience. So if you haven't heard it enough already, be careful who you give your attention to, especially when you're alone like this. Stay aware, always an ER on the side of caution, even when strangers seem harmless. At first, a couple of months ago my friend and I had a spontaneous idea to hike at sunset and eat Subway on the beach. We went to a place called Moore Mountain. We walked the trail for about an hour and right when we got to the beach it was just about pitch black outside. We hadn't thought to bring anything but some weed and some Subway. No flashlights or headlamps or hiking shoes or anything. Dumb idea, I know, but anyway all was well for about the 2 hours that we laid on the beach, smoking and eating and talking about life. It was beautiful, hearing the waves and seeing a sky full of stars. That night I started getting tired, so I decided that we should probably head back. We gathered our stuff and started walking and both turned on our phone flashlights to guide our way. Not even a minute into the trail, we hear something moving in the forest to our left. I told my friend to stop, and the sound suddenly stops too. Immediately when we start walking again, the swishing is there, and it's matching the exact pace that we're walking. So we stop again to test if this sound is really matching our pace. I was hoping that it was an animal just curious about who we were and would walk away, but the sound once again stops. When we stop, my heart starts pounding, because well, there's no animal that I know of that is intelligent enough to match the exact pace and the exact steps that we are making. At least not where we live, and my friend and I turned our flashlights to the left, where the sound was coming from, and it was then that I make eye contact with something in the distance that was pale and had dead black eyes, and looked like it was standing on its high legs with terrible posture. My friend and I quickly turn our flashlight to point directly in front of us, and say please tell me that was an animal, was it? And my friend, in a very monotone voice, says no, we need to leave now, keep your eyes forward for the rest of the hike, the trees and branches. They look like symbols and some even look like nooses. I felt like the forest was telling us to leave, or at least communicating some danger to us or something. Maybe it was just my imagination in the heat of the moment. I'm not sure, but I could have swore that I saw things. After about an hour we finally made it back to the car, and I asked my friend if they noticed anything about the trees, and they also described the symbol. My friend called their mom on the drive home, and she said I'm just happy that you weren't in the Appalachians the next morning. My friend calls me and says we are idiots. We were in the Appalachians last night. I haven't been able to stop thinking about what we saw that night. I also want to add that my friend and we didn't smoke much and are both stoners, so we don't chalk it up to the weed or anything. In any case, if you have any ideas as to what I experienced that night, then I would genuinely love to hear it. This happened about 6 years ago, when I was 20, so I came home after sleeping at my boyfriend's place. It was like 8:00 a.m. super early, because my boyfriend started to shift that early and my parents were already gone like an hour earlier on their holiday, so I was alone at home and I knew it. I came home and I directly went to my bedroom to continue my night, but before climbing the stairs there's 2 floors. I saw the kitchen door or window was wide open. I was surprised by this, but I just thought that maybe my parents accidentally left it open. You have to know that. My father is super paranoid though, and really there was no way that he would have forgot to close it, especially the windows, before leaving the house. For like 2 weeks plus I was sleeping at my boyfriend's place, so there was definitely nobody home, and he would have known that anyway. I was barely awake, so I just closed the door. I checked the kitchen and the living room, just to be sure, and then I went to go to my room. There are 3 rooms on the second floor, and I went to change in my room. Then I went to the bathroom, and I go back to my room. I closed the door to my room and I didn't know why, but I never really did this. Normally in any case, I was scrolling on my phone and like 5 minutes later I heard footsteps right behind my door. Somebody was definitely there the whole time. While I was doing my life, just sort of vulnerably like this. I was terrified. My heart stopped, I couldn't move and I just took the first thing in front of me to defend myself, my baby list. I stared at my door, waiting for the person to open up and kill me, or worse, I was ready to jump out of the window and die. If I saw the door opened minutes ped, and I heard the person on the stairs. I don't know how long I stayed there immobile, but eventually I called my boyfriend and thankfully he came to the rescue. At first I genuinely thought maybe I was going crazy, because I didn't see anything and I couldn't believe that it really happened. But my boyfriend confirmed later that, but they had definitely forced the door or the windows in the kitchen open, so they were really there. They were silently waiting for me to sleep, I guess, so that they could get out of my house. I was home alone, feeling completely safe, but the whole time I wasn't. It was traumatic and I could barely stay alone somewhere without freaking out. To this day, I do live alone and I'm constantly paranoid that someone is trying to break in. But the worst part is that they didn't take anything. My mom's MacBook and jewelry were there. My PS4 was there, my dad's gaming setup. Everything was so easy to take, but they didn't take a thing. I can't stop thinking that they were here for another reason. You also have to know that at that time I was very active on Snapchat. I used to post every day and I used to tell and put my story up every day as well, so the 5K of unknown followers that I had on social media. They knew everything about me at this time, and I personally think that it must have been related. Since then I have stopped my activities on Snapchat, and thankfully nothing else has happened. When I was 12 years old in 2007, I was home alone, babysitting my 2 younger siblings, while my parents they were out at an event. It was summertime, so it stayed light out for a while into the evening. Just as it was starting to get dark, though, I went into the kitchen to make a bowl of popcorn to watch a movie with my brother and sister. When I looked out the kitchen window, I saw that there was a car parked hiding in the tree line of our yard. For context, we lived in a fairly rural place, and we rarely had people out our direction unless they lived down our gravel road, and we knew our neighbor's car. So this was a junkie beater, and the license plates had been taped over as well. It was definitely not one of our neighbors. I was a kid who was pretty aware of my surroundings at the time, and I decided to step back from the big kitchen window and go into the dark entryway hall to get a better look. There was just a single man sitting in it, staring directly at the house with the lights off. Immediately upon noticing that, I locked the front and the back door. I told my little brother and sister calmly to play in their room, and not to come out until I came and got them for the movie night. I then went back to the kitchen to get the phone to call my mother, but she didn't answer. I watched him through the curtains, sit in the dark tree line and stare at the house for what felt like ages. Finally, somebody else drove down the road and their headlights reflected off the car. He started the engine, drove out of the trees and seemed to book it down the gravel. I was still pretty nervous and tried calling my mother again, but again there was no answer for the rest of the time. I just played with my siblings in their room with the door shut and the curtains pulled, until my parents came home later that night. When I tried telling my parents what had happened, They were convinced that I was making it up, and that I was just being a dramatic kid. But I swore up and down that I saw this car, with blacked-out plates and the tree line, and they just weren't interested at all. I know that I saw it, but really I'm the only one who did. Maybe it was just a random guy who didn't know that there were 3 young kids home alone hiding for some other reason, but still I'm really glad that I locked all the doors that evening, because honestly, who knows what could have happened to start this off. I need to give some context. I'm 23 and I currently live in New York City, but I have grandparents who live down in rural West Virginia. When I say rural, I mean the literal boonies. Their closest neighbors are over an hour away in a small town with a few houses and a Walmart. Last summer, my grandfather, who I just call Robert for privacy reasons, had surgery done on his hip. The majority of my family lives on the West Coast and my grandmother, Muriel, is very old and wouldn't have been able to take care of Robert because I was the closest family member. I was the one that they asked to come down there and help out my grandfather, and being the good grandson that I am, I agreed to come down there for 2 weeks while he recovered from his surgery. Fast forward a week. Everything was going fine. All I really had to do was help my grandfather up and down the stairs and walk his dog, a blue heeler named Rocky. Normally my grandfather would walk Rocky once in the morning and once at night through the woods behind their property, but because of the surgery that responsibility had fallen onto me. This was the part that I hated about helping him, because ever since I was a kid, I never really liked those woods behind the property. Whenever I'd go down there as a kid, me and my cousins would always get creeped out going into that forest. It always just felt off for some reason, but anyways, for the first week, walking Rocky in the forest at night was fine, even if it was a bit creepy. That was until one night a week into my stay. I was walking him through the forest. It was around 8:30 and the sun was setting over the Appalachian Mountains. Everything was going normal until I heard a strange whistle that sounded like it was only around 20 yards away. Both me and the dog stopped dead in our tracks and looked towards the direction the whistling was coming from. I shined my flashlight in that direction, but I didn't see anything, so I had just assumed that it was a bird. Looking back, though, it definitely wasn't a bird. There's no nocturnal bird that chirp and whistle out there, and it sounded more musical than anything. A bird could whistle anyway, but the dog was spooked. He wouldn't stop growling and staring at whatever was back there, and he kept trying to back up until whatever, or whoever this thing was, whistled again, to which the dog started barking and going absolutely crazy. At this point, I decided that I definitely didn't want to stay there, so I yanked on the dog's leash, and we both bolted out of the woods and straight back home. When we got back, I told my grandparents what had happened. They both seemed spooked and my grandmother immediately asked if I whistled back. I told her that I didn't and she seemed relieved, but told me that I didn't hear anything and to just ignore it. I asked why and she wouldn't tell me, and would instead just tell me that I didn't hear anything. I decided not to press it any further, and I just went to bed terrified and wondering what she seemed to be so freaked out about now. The next morning she told me that instead of walking Rocky through the woods, I could just take him on laps around the house, and so that's what I started doing. Every night I would take Rocky for around 50 laps around the house before going back inside on Friday, the third to last day that I would stay there at night. I was taking the dog for laps, as usual, until I heard that same creepy whistle behind the attached garage this time, which was only around 10 yards from the house. This time I immediately took the dog back inside and locked the doors. The rest of the night, I put my earbuds in and I ignored any more whistling, like my grandmother told me to this day. I really still don't know what the whistling in the woods was all about. Some of my friends said that it was a skinwalker, but that's a Navajo thing and there's almost no Navajo. When Virginia, my girlfriend who stayed back in New York City, asked her Muslim parents, who are from Yemen, and they said that whistling at night is a sign that a jinn is nearby. I don't know about any of that and I don't know what it was, but whatever it was, it had my grandparents legitimately scared. I've heard of weird stuff happening in Appalachia, but this really is the first time that I've ever had a first-hand experience with it, so that's why I'm here. Do any of you guys have any idea as to what this could have been? I've lived in a number of houses and just last night I saw it for the second time, and I have no idea what it is. Around 4 or 5 years ago, I lived in a house built in the 1920s to 1930s, and there was one night that I was sleeping in the basement that I woke up. I've always had difficulty sleeping at night, and consistently woke up between 1:00 and 4:00 in the morning. It was an issue that I had from like ages 8 to 16. In any case, I woke up and there was this black mist in the corner of my room. Weirdly too. I wasn't scared, but it just felt like it was there. It was thick enough that I couldn't see through it, but after a moment I shined a flashlight on it with my phone, then turned the light off, and it was gone. Fast forward to now, and I just got back home from a 12-day trip. My family moved, so our current home was constructed in the past 10 years. I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm 20 now, so it's been years since I've done that, and looked to my left and there was a black mist right beside my bed, probably around 4 to 5 feet in height. Again, I wasn't scared, but I just turned back over and said I'm safe and something else that I can't really recall right now, but then I just fell back to sleep. This experience has been interesting for me too, and I wonder what the apparition could be, if it's an apparition at all. My response was unnormal as well, right? I mean, I've been a bit stressed lately, but I also feel revitalized since going to see some family on vacation. In any case, if you've got any ideas as to what this was, then please do share, and if you can provide any help with this, then I would love to hear from you. When we were kids, my brother and I slept in the same room in a bunk bed. I was always a heavy guy, so I'd sleep on the bottom and he slept up top. We both remember this night did this day, which obviously could just be because we've talked about it so many times over the years and have tricked our brains into treating it as fact. But still. Anyway, we are both asleep and at the foot of our bed is a window. There's a street light across the road, so there was literally always some light coming through the curtains. We always sleep with our heads towards the other way, so that window would be at our feet. I'm not entirely sure what woke me up, but when I did, I just had that overwhelming feeling of somebody watching me. I wake up and open my eyes, and at the foot of my bed is a literal shadow person, and I mean you could very clearly see the person's outline with the lit-up curtain behind him, like absolutely pitch black against a white lit-up cloth curtain. He was definitely wearing a hat, but like just a hat, like a baseball sort of trucker-shaped hat. He was also two-hand holding what looked like a firefighter's wood-cutting axe. It was pretty long, I recall, but I just kind of sat there for a good minute, completely frozen in fear. He didn't move at all. That I can remember, but after a minute or two, in the deepest and most gruff voice that I've ever heard, he just says, "One day at that, I flipped and hid under the covers because as a child I couldn't think of anything else that I could do." After another minute passed, I just hear my brother's shivering voice say, "John, did you see that too?" I answered that I had, and we just kind of laid there in silence, and eventually we both drifted off back to sleep, I guess. But we both swear that we remember it like 20 years later. I'm also wondering if anybody else has heard of an experience or something similar to this, as we have no idea what it was that we saw and haven't seen. Anyone say that they've experienced something like this? Theories we've tossed around go from just a straight-up demon or evil spirit to a literal home intruder to a grim reaper type thing. That last one always seemed to make sense to me because of what it said to us, but it never did show up again for either of us. My mom took over that room a while after for a few years. Then I took it for a few, and now my brother still lives back at home, and it's his room. So we've all had ample time with nothing happening, which is a bit weird, right? So when I was in kindergarten or first grade about 22 to 23 years ago, I saw an apparition that seems very cliché, an old woman in a white dress, No lips with snarling teeth, black eyes floating and no visible feet. At first I heard this woman's footsteps coming down the hallway on the hardwood floor. Then I saw her come to the end of the hallway, my room on the right, my mom's on the left. This woman stopped at the end of the hallway and slowly looked back and forth between the rooms, her head oscillating like a fan, slow but consistent. She then turned around and walked away slowly, footsteps, fading into nothing at this time. I shared a room with my brother, 4 years older than me, who was also awake, and saw the woman too. I called his name quietly and he said, "Shut up. I see her too. Put your blanket over your head." I've asked him multiple times throughout our lives about this happening, and he has zero recollection of it. So I assumed in the end that it was just an extremely vivid dream that was stuck with me for my whole life. I never brought this story up with anybody else. Well, until recently, you see, my mother and I were talking about some paranormal experiences that we had throughout our lives. I said something about the Carell house, but never went into detail, and she proceeded to explain to me, the exact same woman that I saw wearing a white dress, at the end of the hallway, looking back and forth between our rooms. Honestly, I felt sick. This apparition was no longer a vivid dream. I mean, that actually happened. She was real. She was there and she was looking at me. But how many times did she actually do that while I was asleep, and I never saw her? I have a lot of questions that really I don't have answers to, but I will say that without a question. I am a believer now. Several years ago, I was living in College Station, Texas. The job market there is really rough for anyone outside of academia, but I landed a job as a sales consultant for a digital marketing company, or at least that's what I was told after I started. I found out my job would really be in door-to-door sales, trying to sell digital marketing packages and, well, phone book ads to small businesses. The company was terrible. The managers were pure evil and the product was awful. I was looking for a new job, but I needed a paycheck. Now, one day they sprang something on us. From now on, we would only spend half of the year in College Station. The other half, we would be living in a hotel in a bean, selling phone book ads there. My wife was so understanding about this. I'd be able to come back home on the weekends, and I had a few promising leads for work too. I figured that I'd only need to spend a month or so there now, the first time I'm heading out. I actually quite enjoy the view on the trip, lots of small towns and interesting landscapes, but even better. I look down at my phone as I'm partway through my trip and I'm making way better time than expected, like way better an hour ahead of schedule. In fact, I was certain that I had checked my phone before and that hadn't been the case, but the clock on the dash confirmed it, and that was when I was just pulling through a town called Rising Star. I'm a big horror and occult fan, and immediately made a mental connection to Lucifer, since it means morning star, and gave myself a bit of a chuckle. It was a small town, but despite it being broad daylight, I was surprised to see really no one. I mean, I didn't see a single person. I slowed down looking into the windows, but nothing. It was summer, and I mean there weren't even any kids around playing in the yards or anything. I saw parked cars, but no one driving or sitting in one. That's when I passed what I seem to recall being an old brick drugstore. There on the side of the building was a mural of a man, with a bunch of snakes dangling from his mouth. It really creeped me out, especially with my previous Lucifer connection. Part of me was tempted to stop somewhere just to see if I could find a human being at some point. But that mural, something about it changed my mind, and as soon as I left that town, I looked at my phone and my cast clock again. They were both an hour ahead of where they had been before. I did research later, and there was an innocent explanation about the mural involving a local celebrity, who participated in a lot of rattlesnake roundups, and I think had a Guinness record for doing something like this. I can look up his name again later if anybody's curious, but still that time fluctuation and the eerie absence of people, something about it just didn't feel right, and it still haunts me. I also regularly have nightmares about that place to this day, which is strange in any case. I took a different route from then on and soon found a new job as well, but I always joke with my friends that I have a feeling that I'll be back there one day, and I won't come back. Really, though, it's only half a joke, I suppose, because that's always what happens in my nightmares. When I was 19, about 20 years ago now, I was renting a flat and lived alone. On the first night there, I was laying in bed trying to sleep, when all of a sudden I heard loud footsteps running up my hallway and stopping just outside of my bedroom door. Instantly I sat up expecting the door to swing open, but then there was silence and nothing else happened. As I sat there a few nights later, I was trying to sleep and then I could hear someone breathing. It sounded like they was standing to the side of the bed near my head, but I couldn't see anyone there. After that, every few nights, I would hear the breathing right behind me as well, regardless of what room I was in at various times during the day, but mostly at night. What really freaked me out, though, and confirmed things, was that one time I had a friend staying over. We were watching TV in the living room and the breathing started. He looked at me and goes, "Is that you breathing?" And the only thing that I could think to answer was no, that just happens sometimes. I only stayed there until my 6-month lease ran out, because I was way too freaked out and tried to sleep at friends' houses as much as I could. The day that I was moving out, I noticed footprints on the ceiling of all places. The ceiling was also way too high up for anyone to be able to put their bare feet on. It was a freaky place to live, and I was glad to leave it behind. This story is from about 5 years ago, when I worked security for a large office or furniture manufacturer in Michigan. I did mainly foot and vehicle patrols of primarily the 3 factory plants, but occasionally the corporate office buildings, and an older home that the company bought and refurbished. The company would use the home for tours for the public, and they would use it for some like wow factor for potential buyers. They flew in to make a sale for more reference. This home was designed by a famous architect and is known for its style and large bay windows and painted glass. The home. It was built in the early 1900s and, as far as I'm aware, no one ever died in the home or anything like that. Now I worked midnight shifts 11:00 p.m. to 7:00 a.m., and we had a bit of a storm rolling in the night of my shift at about 1:30 a.m. The control operator received fire alarm fault from the fire panel at the home, and when compared to prior alarms that night and the weather that we were experiencing, it was presumed that the power had gone out, and when I came back on set off the fire alarm fault. So I was dispatched as a precaution to ensure everything was okay, and to reset the fire alarm panel. I got to the home at around 4:05 in the morning and made my way into the home. I had been there a handful of other times and fellow security guards had told me about weird occurrences that had happened around the house over the years. The main story was about them seeing the light on upstairs and a black silhouette of a figure standing in the window just watching them. There were also stories from the tour guides of the home that stated that the dolls in the nursery would be found in different locations from when they last saw them, when nobody else was entering that room anyways. I made my way to the basement, which is where the fire alarm panel was located. I reset the panel and attempted to radio to the control operator to see if the fault had reset. At this time it was around 2:00 a.m., and my radio was completely just refusing to operate. It was making weird noises when I tried to key it up and kept losing signal. I didn't think too much of it and pulled my phone out and called them. Instead, I was able to establish a phone call, but it kept cutting out and had a lot of feedback until the call finally dropped and my phone went into SOS. In any case, I decided to do a bit of a walkthrough of the house, since I was already there and wanted to kill some time. Anyway, I went back upstairs, walked through the kitchen into the dining room and into the living room. The large windows noted earlier are primarily in the living room. The lights were old in the home and they were operated by buttons on the walls and not switches, but I elected to just use my flashlight instead. I walked into the living room and did a quick once-over of the room with my flashlight, and for a split second in the reflection of the bay window, I could have sworn that I saw an old man seated in the chair, sitting less than 5 feet away from me. He was staring at me through the reflection, with an eerily emotionless face. I sort of doubled back while questioning what I just saw, but the image was now burned into my mind when I looked back. There was nothing. I immediately felt uneasy, though, and I paused momentarily, but elected to continue my walkthrough of the home. The staircase was beside the living room, and went up to a landing maybe about 10 feet long, which proceeded to another staircase to the second floor. I proceeded up the stairs and stepped into the landing, and I cannot describe the feeling that rushed over me into words. It was like something out of the movies. All of the hair of my body stood up and my face went cold, as all the blood just rushed away, and I had an immediate sense of danger. Needless to say, I sprinted out of that home to my patrol vehicle and sped off without looking back. They eventually pulled the video footage of me sprinting out of the house, and it was a bit of a joke for a while, but I know what I saw and I know what I felt. Sometimes I wonder if the people working there now are told of my weird and interesting story. I wonder if any of them ever had their own encounters or experiences. Really, though, who knows, I personally really don't have much experience with the supernatural. However, my late best friend, who passed away over 20 years ago when we were 19, once told me about the following encounter that she had, and I would like to see if anybody else has had any similar experiences or sightings to this. So she told me that when she was 7 or 8, she and her dad were napping on a big pallet after watching a movie in their living room. It was the middle of the day on a weekend. Their living room, in which her dad still lives, has big glass panes on one wall overlooking the back patio. The house sits on some significant acreage in the brushy woods of central Texas, no neighbors within at least half a mile, likely more. But my friend said that she woke up from a nap to see a woman standing right outside the big window, covered in rags, possibly pelts, even with leaves and twigs in her hair. I think she described her as old, but I can't remember with absolute certainty. As my friend looked at though the woman started opening her mouth, and apparently it just kept getting wider and wider, well beyond normal human capabilities. She shook her dad awake and screamed for him to look out at the window, and when they both looked, she was gone. She swore up and down that it wasn't a dream though. Her dad didn't believe her, of course, but I did and I still do. She was my soul sister, and I knew when she was being truthful. So does anyone have any ideas? I've looked into Baaga and various forest hags, etc. But the widening mouth never seems to be a distinct feature of anything I've come across over the years. So is there anything else like this? That sounds familiar. I cannot pinpoint exactly when I first began to experience this. Best that I can remember is I was around the age of 10 to 11, although it's possible the occurrences began a little earlier than this. However, I vividly remember being scared of my bedroom window once it got dark outside. Because of what I regularly saw on numerous occasions, I would see the same face in the bottom left-hand corner on the outside of the window, just looking in at me for context. My bedroom at the time was on the second floor of the house, so no possibility. This was just somebody walking by the window, unless they were like over 15 foot tall. That is despite this occurring over 20 years ago now. For context, I'm in my mid-30s. I can still recall that face too. It was distinctly male, with thin, unkempt hair. The skin pulled in as though the figure was starved. If I had to age the figure, my best guess would be in its 30s, maybe 40s. Oddly, though, the one detail I can't remember are the eyes. The reason that I can remember this much detail, though, is because it was always the same face, always in the same position. Seeing this figure always gave me a sense of dread, and I would do whatever I could to pretend that it wasn't there watching me. I would suddenly glue my eyes to my TV or pick up a book and start reading, hoping that it would leave me alone. I didn't have curtains in my bedroom, so I didn't have that as an option. Back then, and whenever I called my parents to check, they never saw anything and simply passed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. That dread that I felt whenever I saw the figure would stay with me for the rest of the night, until I eventually managed to fall asleep when I did sleep. I would have these really upsetting dreams almost every night, dreams of being chased and, in a lot of cases, even being killed. I remember speaking to my therapist about a reoccurring dream that I would have, where I was chased and thrown off a bridge that I had to cross on my walk to school with, but they didn't read much into it to this day. In fact, I have issues sleeping. My partner has mentioned several times that I have a tendency to whimper in my sleep, as if frightened I can never sleep through a full night either, waking up at least 2 or 3 times for no reason. I also still try to avoid going past windows at night, unless the windows are drawn first, and even then I still feel slightly uneasy, and it wasn't just seeing the figure in the window either. There would be occasions I would go and turn on the light in my room, but it just wouldn't work. It would turn on and the bulb would do something, but the light was just very dim. Just a dark orange glow, barely lighting anything up. The first time this happened, I instinctively knew something was wrong, and every subsequent time instilled that same anxiety. The bit that I never got to understand was why it happened. Every time it did, I would quickly turn the light back off and call my parents. They would come up and turn the light on for me, and everything worked fine, for some unexplainable reason. It was only ever when I was alone that the light played up like this, just as it was only ever when I was alone that I would see the figure in the window, as if it was trying to mess with my mind or just didn't want to make its presence known to anyone else. After several years of this, my sister started to become frightened of a grey figure stalking my father around the house, which only she could ever see. On one occasion, she started screaming and crying for apparently no reason. When we managed to calm her down enough to speak, she told us that she saw the figure reaching out trying to stab my father in the back. It was at this point that I definitely knew that something wasn't right, and confided in the school chaplain. It was at that point that I definitely knew something wasn't right, and confided in the school chaplain. We weren't a religious family in any sense, but I attended a Catholic high school, and at this point I didn't really know who else to turn to. The school chaplain came over to the house and blessed the premises. Whilst it wasn't a full exorcism or anything, he made sure to bless every room, anointing the doorways with holy water, and whatever it was that we experienced in all those strange occurrences. It all just stopped following the visit from the chaplain that day. We moved house roughly 18 months after that. I've lived in several houses since then and have never experienced the figure again, but, as mentioned, I'm still anxious about going near windows at night, so its effects upon me are still very real. Whatever it was, I did experience what my family experienced. I can't say for sure, perhaps a ghost or some sort of malevolent entity. I really have no idea, but I wanted to share my experience nonetheless, and see what you guys think. 25 plus years ago, I was friends with a married couple that lived in a raised ranch on the mountain in a modestly populated area. The door was always open and I was a frequent visitor. Since the first time that I was at that house, I always felt uneasy, like there was some type of a presence there quietly observing. Quick backstory too is that the land the house was built on was Native American territory back in the day, and I later came to learn and experience many phenomenon, but I'll focus on this one story. So I was to meet my friends at the house for an evening out, but they were both working and probably not home yet, but I decided to wait for them there. I drove there and took the corner on their street, pitch black, not unusual, no street lights. As I near the house, I notice all the lights are on inside, outside, postal, and I think that they must be home. Chills run through me, though, and I decided to pull into the driveway because neither of their cars are there. I sat in the driveway for a minute looking around, listening, with a heavy type of feeling coming over me, yet decided to turn my car off and go in anyway. I get to the front door, gently turn the knob and slowly open their door, peeking inside. I see nothing and hear nothing, but all of the light are still on. I hesitated to go any further. I call out hello, still standing in the doorway looking up the stairs, and in one moment all the lights suddenly went out, including the ones outside. I immediately froze in fear, total darkness and total silence. My arm felt heavy, shutting the door, and attempting to get back to my car while guided by moonlight. It was weird, because it was as if weights were on my ankles and I struggled to make it inside of my car. My hands were shaking so bad that I barely was able to get the key in the ignition. I felt tightness in my chest and I was shaking and I couldn't breathe. Just a total feeling of hopeless dread engulfed me. I parked on the road by the mailbox, sat there staring at the house in darkness, trying to compose myself, for I don't even know how long. Eventually the wife pulled up and I put the window down. "You could have gone and you know," she says, before looking at my face and asking what was wrong. I just pointed at her house. She parked in the driveway, and she walked back to my car, while her husband was pulling in. He comes down and asks why we are outside, and I told him that I'll wait here while they get ready. The wife then asks though something happened, didn't it? I nodded yes to this, still shaking. The wife looked at the husband and says it's starting up again. I was close friends with them for many years, even staying there temporarily, and their house. Let's just say that it had quite the history. In 1999, we lived in a badly possessed or haunted house for about 8 years in Beaver Creek, Oregon, and genuinely I really don't like talking about it's honestly very cliché horror story, or textbook sort of stuff. And people think that I'm just bullspitting. So I prefer to just keep it simple. But literally the house was at a deal with weirdly boarded up rooms. The family had been sleeping in just one area together. The whole affair was an awakening and a sort of you get what you pay for sometimes go with your gut type lesson. It all started pretty benign, though. We immediately took down all the boards to open the rooms and couldn't figure out their purpose, as the rooms were bare but fine. We were doing construction, which is pretty typical, right? The house wasn't terribly old, like maybe 1950s, but then there was just like small stuff. One of the first instances I remember is we had the holding stacked on the right side of the hall labeled to be put back up, and at about 2:00 a.m., we could hear it sort of clanking. When we checked it had been rolled and moved to the left. We thought that maybe we misremembered the direction, but the next night it moved back. My husband and I were suddenly always arguing for no good reason, and would have dread about coming home without knowing why. Also instant relief to leave them. It progressed from there over months to full on getting scratched hit terrorized for me. I'll leave some personal details out here, but it was a rough couple of years. Eventually, it was bad enough that my husband had his guns missing when he'd been cleaning them, only to have them reappear, loaded and pointed at him off the back of the couch. It had finally decided messing with him would be fun as well. It previously really just picked on me and he honestly considered that I was having a mental health crisis, but he kept hearing me weeping at night when I wasn't. We had called multiple churches. None of them would help. I was raised Catholic, and that was especially disappointing, but not surprising. I suppose. The Pentecostal church did eventually try to help us, and they didn't like what they found. I don't like the labels, but I'm sure you can guess what they called it and said that they'd need the whole congregation to get rid of it, wanted me to get baptized, to move forward and all that long. Story short, they still couldn't get rid of it and it just came back. More ticked off than ever. It seemed. We had to learn to just not feed it any fear or stress or anger, and we had to cleanse every couple of days for the rest of the years that we lived there. I also had a crash course in alt stuff to deal with it myself, because it was pretty obvious that there was no easy access to help. I did manage it at home much better from then on, though, and I took control of my own space. But we had such bad luck too, those whole 8 years that we were there. But my husband is a vet, and he was struggling to get his disability to 100, even though he was forced out on medical because he couldn't work like he used to. Eventually, that house caused us bankruptcy, and we let the bank take it willingly too to get out. I just couldn't bring myself to sell it to someone. After all of that, when we moved, I was really afraid too that it was going to follow us. My husband went back up one last time to grab some furniture and stuff that we'd left. The power had been turned off with the electric company the week before, and when you came in, all the lights were on. The AC was blowing. Water was running in the faucet. He just backed out and called me, "You mind if we just leave?" The rest is what he said. I didn't make him go back in, so in the end we left a sofa set and a bunch of other stuff behind. I swear, though, that the first night in the new house I saw what some would call an angel. I'm not a Christian, so I just say light, and felt such peace and relief, a strong knowing that it was done and we wouldn't be followed. I couldn't remember ever sleeping so well up until that time as well, and genuinely I loved that rental. Now here's the thing we found out. A bunch of weird stuff after this as well. The last 3 people who had owned it before us had also filed bankruptcy, and they had been foreclosed on as well, which I found interesting. Also, once you've lived with the paranormal like that, you're more open whether you'd like to be or not, so there's always something knocking around our homes. Now I no longer fear it. I'm kind of numb to it. To be honest, it's really just normal for us, but never again has it been something like that either. I had a healer for a while and she called it a forced colony from overexposure to a strong entity. But again, I don't know about any of that, and I'm just glad that we are out of there, and we never had to go back. When I was 13 or 14, I had a nightmare that woke me up. At the time I slept on the bottom bunk bed that I shared with my brother, feeling relieved that it was just a dream. I opened my eyes a little bit more, and see a 6 tall thin silhouette standing next to my bed squinting. I looked at its face and it looked like my older brother smiling at me. I wondered what on earth he was doing in my room in the middle of the night like this. He slept in the room across the hall, but then I saw my brother's face morph into an androgynous stranger with long blonde hair and a menacing smile. It extended its hands, and in one of its hands I saw an axe with a half-moon blade. The figure began to raise the axe above its head, both hands on the hilt ready to strike, and it jumped toward me at a speed probably half the speed of what you'd expect. I shouted as loudly as I could while yanking my covers over my face and turning away from the figure. My scream woke up my whole family, and I can't prove that it was a dream within a dream, but honestly it felt real to me. I also experienced a strange phenomena in that room, like an RC car turning its wheels randomly in the quiet hours of the early morning. Its only controller, though, was resting on my dresser empty of batteries. Don't forget to subscribe for more scary adventures.